bit about the origins of this this extraordinary film that we've just seen. It's your third recent documentary about a seminal pop music figure coming after Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones. How did you come to this subject?
Well, I think it's taken about 5 years. What is it now? 2011. I think I was doing Departed or something. I don't want to go off on another track, but I honestly don't really remember very much of it, except that Margaret, I think you told me that Olivia wanted to meet me, and Nigel mentioned it, about a possibility of putting together something on George's life. So I remember having a meeting, but it took us a while to get the meeting, so you may have to jump in here because you have the chronology better, I think. Nigel, I think you, David, and Margaret. But it took us a while to get the meeting, and at the meeting, Olivia brought some items from the archive, which were quite moving and beautiful. And I guess at that meeting, too, we just sort of figured out what the ground rules were if we were going to go ahead. But then it took us, I think, another 8 or 9 months before we started editing some footage together and trying to find a way to approach the story, because there are many different obstacles, obviously. Maybe you could be more enlightening on that. It's a plural. That means Margaret, Nigel, Olivia, David. What do you think, how it started? Because I remember having meetings in my office, and then David was in the other room, and then I was working with Thelma, so I going back and forth around these, a lot of energy in these 3 or 4 rooms constantly. So, Margaret, do you remember?
Yeah, after No Direction Home, which Nigel and David and Marty and I worked on together, Nigel let me know that he was meeting and speaking with Olivia Harrison about the possibility of doing a documentary about George Harrison, and he was very early in that process, and he said that they were looking for directors, and it seemed to me, knowing Marty for many years, that subject would be quite fascinating to Marty. There would be a lot of themes that would be appealing to him that he would like to maybe tackle. So we just talked about the idea of getting Olivia and Marty together and to try to see if that was something that was, that both of them wanted to pursue. And so that's really, I think, the way everyone got together. And then it was many, many years of trying to both, on one track, Olivia was managing this fabulously, this archive of extraordinary material, and it was a matter of getting that together and then also preparing to tell the story of the life,
Can I add do you want to?
No, go ahead.
I mean, I remember the meeting thinking at the time this was a very special meeting to be in. Olivia had brought 2 beautiful letters that George had written, and some postcards and some photographs, and Marty and Olivia talked together about Olivia's ideas for the project, and then Olivia read this letter, and it was a very moving letter that George wrote to his mother when he was 22 about his views of life. And at the end of the letter, I thought I was moved almost to tears, and I felt slightly embarrassed. I looked up, and with respect to my dear friend Marty, I saw that Marty himself was very moved, and I remember thinking, this meeting's going well. Olivia, if you have any memories of that.
I think I chose those particular items because my main concern was that George's outer life was well known, and that would be an easy thing to do. That you could put together that story, but the inner life was going to be impossible. And I knew, how deeply George felt about certain things in life and what he was trying to achieve. And I thought that letter from a very early age was just a seed of what he was thinking, that no matter, that at the very pinnacle of young, very early career of the Beatles, there was something telling him this was not going to fulfill him. And I think that I was hoping that's what happened. It transpired that's exactly what Marty tuned into. And I think that's really
that's always been the interest for me in George's life, because from his his music with the group, and then of course his All Things Must Pass and all his music after that. So I always had obviously a special interest in what he was, how he perceived life, and what he was searching for, maybe.
Well, and a question from, I guess, really from Marty and for David, if it's not too amorphous a question, can you talk a little bit about sort of finding the form of the film, working with all of this archival footage and sort of deciding the structure of the film and what to include and what to leave out, especially when you're dealing with a history like the history of the Beatles that's so well known. To me, one of the things that's so fascinating about the film is it seems to be equally appreciated by people who know an incredible amount about George Harrison and the Beatles and people who are relative novices when it comes to the subject.
Should I start, David, and you could help me out? David works in a room right next to my office, and then so we'd have these talks, really long talks. I think bottom line is that obviously we had to deal with the period of the Beatles as the group. So I think let's deal with that immediately, but and try to get past that information, so to speak, and the established. That's going in. We know it's a given, and here it is. We even if as I recall, at one point we just move up the end of the Beatles, really the signing of the papers, as soon as possible. But really, it's long discussions about why I was attracted to making the movie, and it was a matter of him trying to having everything in his life, and then still not being fulfilled. Finding or trying to find something beyond that, trying to find a meaning beyond that. If not a meaning, then some sort of a spiritual transcendence in his life. And this comes through many different ways, but it has to come through the music. But primarily, ultimately, he's going towards, as we all are, towards death. So this is how we talked about what the film should be from the very beginning, the beginning of that journey to the end of our lives, then, and whatever. And David, maybe you could fill in a little more on that.
Well, we didn't necessarily cut everything in the film in order, but the first thing that we did cut was the very beginning and all the way through to where the brothers appear. All and one of the challenges of the film is if George writes his first song, a third of the way into part one, how do you make it musical before that? And Marty, came in with this idea that you have All Things Must Pass at the very beginning of the film. And we cut that war sequence, the way the music comes in and out, George Formby, the war stuff. And I think, in a way, that informed that and the very, very beginning of the film, people talking about George. In a way, those two things informed everything else that we cut afterwards, because both in terms of style, but also in terms of tone. I think that the interviews in the film, the filmed interviews, are really great interviews, but also they're the feeling that you get at the very beginning, the intimacy of these guys. We tried to have that kind of personal tone with these interviews all through the movie.
But again, what we decided was that it wouldn't necessarily be chronological. And we just went through, and also we tried not to be, and he found many different ways of doing it. We didn't want to state, okay, this is the period when such and such happens, this is this period. David found in such a way with the interviews to layer in major changes in the midst of an answer, let's say, Joan Taylor, when she talks about meeting them, and he had his Romany caravan painted car, rolls, I think, and at one point she says someone took acid, and then they gave so-and-so acid, another person took acid, and there wasn't any discussion prior to that about drugs or anything else, and it's done in a very, very quiet tone, the way I think it would be in a casual situation. And so this is that, and Astrid and all of them in Hamburg, all of that we tried to sort of approach all these points of his life in an oblique way, but ultimately ending with going towards the goal of being released.
And David, you mentioned the music in the film. So for you and anyone else on the panel who wants to jump in on this, can you talk about creating the sound of the film, which is really extraordinary, both in terms of the selection of the songs that would be included and also the mixing of them. I've seen this movie now twice in two different theaters, and both times it's sort of been like being at a great rock concert, frankly, and I've never heard these songs sound like this before.
Do you want to start with mixing the songs, Marty, or do you want me to do it?
I think you better start with the mixing of the song. Explain the tracks first.
Well, it's a crazy thing for you know. I'm not a musician. You're in a studio with Giles Martin and Paul Hicks mix the music, but they have the original recorded Beatles tracks for the Beatles material. So for us, just to hear one track of a 4-track, for instance, that was done in 1963 or 1964, it's amazing. And then the idea was that they would remix for film and for 5.1, but in the spirit of the original mixes. And I think they did a great job. And then in New York, we mixed with Tom Fleischman. It's kind of another layer of perspective of filmmaking, to do the film mix on top of the mix that they had already done.
Well, we completely monitored those mixes. Not only did it, but Giles would bring another mix into New York, and I'd play it in my screening room or the place, and I'd say, well, it's not enough. Suddenly, at one point, we were talking about it being clean and clear, but it wasn't rock and roll.
Right.
It didn't have a certain kind of excitement to it. I don't know what that is, but I said, well, maybe it's bass, maybe it's the strings, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. So go back, you work on it, and come back, and we played in different places. But this went on constantly for a couple of years, until we got that what we liked, what we thought we liked. I mean, for me, the whole search, as when Ravi Shankar says in the movie, he says, words can only do so much, and talking about compassion and love. He said, we have an advantage. We play music. We create music. They have the advantage. So it's all through the music, really. That's why the mixing of the music was so important. It's all through George's ability to express himself, or any great musician, composer, to express themselves and to find a kind of meaning in life with his work through the music. So the mixing took quite a while, I think.
Years.
Yeah, a couple of years at least.
I'm going to turn this over to our audience here in the theater. Just a note to the people in London, I'll repeat the questions. There'll be a slight delay, but bear with us. Over there, you, sir?
Oh, yes. Being in the Beatles is for Olivia. Being in the Beatles and living in that material world literally afforded George the opportunity to find himself spiritually. Did he ever talk about that dichotomy? And do you, Olivia, feel that he may have still searched for that spirituality if he was just a working class guy that was not in the Beatles?
It's a question for Olivia. The question is that it being in the Beatles and becoming, a star afforded George the opportunity to seek these deeper spiritual questions that he did, and did he? The question for Olivia is: did he have a sense of that sort of that tension between what got him to the place where he could seek the answers to those questions, and do you feel that he would have still been such a seeker had he just been an ordinary working stiff?
I don't know, but he was a man of extremes, and so he had this extreme experience, which obviously would lead him to want the opposite. He talked a lot about the equal and opposite effect. So I think his seeking was equal and opposite to what his career was and what his life was like, which was pretty crazy and frenetic. So perhaps not. Who can say? But certainly his seeking was equal and opposite to where he found himself.
Over here. Yes.
A question for Mr. Scorsese, Mr. Jeske.
a question for David and Marty. Was there anything specific that was cut from the final version of the film that you wish you could have kept in there?
Oh, yes. Many wonderful things. Do you any offhand, David? What do you think?
Just there's songs that maybe
Yeah.
weren't in there, but I wish were in there. You know, Taxman's one of my favorite songs. It's not in there. The Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp. It's a great song, not in there. You know, there's a lot of stuff.
It was a long process, so I mean, and I think he went through hundreds of hours of film, David, before he even showed me selects, really. So it took a while. I mean, actually, David and Margaret, you put together a book for me of, and I remember I was in the hotel, so it was after or right before I was doing Departed, Shutter Island, I think, and it had all these DVDs and for me to take a look at certain things that were there in the archive. And I told the story before, but it's I put the first DVD in. It was just myself in this living room with a big television screen. And this image of the tulips comes up on the screen. And I'm just watching it, and I don't know what it is. And I hear these footsteps, and then I see George Harrison's face come into frame. And he just stares at me for a long time. Just two of us in the room. And I'm sort of looking around and realizing, wait a minute, this is what's going to happen, I guess, right here. It's between the two of us. So that was it. That was the very first thing I put on that I, after discussing, and I think that was about almost 8 months into the process, really. But the stuff that you had originally sent, because you kept saying you were sending stuff, but
I used to
never
make
really sent
a treasure.
things.
It was difficult to let go, but I kept sending these little treasure chests to Marty with things that I thought would engage him more and more and more. So I guess I succeeded.
Yeah. Yeah, he did sing Tiptoe Through the Tulips on a uke on that one. I would like to have kept that in the film, but we weren't able to.
And some of the interviews were hours and hours long.
Oh, yes.
So there's a lot of material.
Yeah, we interviewed, I would say about 25 people. I mean, some number of people who all had incredible things to say about their relationship, their experience working with him and knowing him. And, each interview, I mean, I think we did one interview that was 8 hours long. And, you can only use, moments from those. So that's something that could be its own series, of films.
Over here, yes.
Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people at that time were engaged in similar spiritual quests to George Harrison. How did you, in framing and looking at this part of his personality, think about that aspect, which for some from that period of time can be an emotional battlefield?
It's a question the gentleman is saying. There were thousands, if not millions, of other people who were also on a similar spiritual quest to George at that time in our culture. And how did you think about his framing his search in that sort of broader context of what was going on in society at that time?
Well, I think being around at the time, of course, and I think being of the same age, I think, as George, the idea of being younger and also being Roman Catholic, but the idea of a group as powerful, a group of young people as powerful in not only in the music world, popular music, but also in our culture, in the world's culture, in the West's culture, to accept and to take and accept and bring in other cultures on a very serious same level as the Western thinking. Whereas before, to populist groups like where I came from, and you'd see films about Indians or films about Africans, and they were presented in a certain way. This was an embracing of a way of thinking saying, we've got a lot to learn, not just Western civilization. And this was the first, in my mind, that I can remember being so excited by this. And of course, everybody around remembers who's there at that time. This was radical, very radical. I had known the music somewhat because I remember seeing the Sergeant Ray films, Pate Panchali and the other two films at Aparajito and A World of Opu, all together on one night at the Carnegie Hall Cinema. And I never heard an instrument like that. I thought it was amazing. It was 1959 or 1960 or whatever. And so I found the record. I was telling a story. I found the record in the old Sam Goodies. There was improvisations, Ravi Shankar improvisations, and theme from Pate Panchali. And so I was becoming aware of this. And then I realized that in Jean Renoir's The River, I heard that sitar, you see. And it made me understand, not understand, curious and very, very excited about other religions, other cultures. And here was this, the most powerful group in music history in that last century, embracing this new, for us in the West, or at least for my group, a very, very different way of thinking about life and, I should say, about the soul or the spiritual life, really. To take what you can from it, if it works for you in that way. But it's the opening of the mind that way and the acceptance of other things and against certitude, against the certitude. And that was interesting, opening the mind constantly. For me, and I don't know whether it was... at that time, I guess I was around at that time. In terms of Woodstock was the first time I really had a close association with groups of people at that time who were trying to find the same thing. But this is 4 years later, though, 4 or 5 years later. So for me, it always came through the music first, you see, and that opened the way to try to understand other ways of life and thinking. So. I don't know if that answers it, but David, what do you think?
I'm not sure. It's interesting. One of the things that a lot of people point out at the end of part one, there's a being in London, and people are always, what was that footage?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And I think to us, it didn't really matter, and it wasn't necessarily about giving exact cultural context. It was the feeling of the time, and the feeling worked, for the film, and it worked for the song,
Yeah.
And I couldn't tell you exactly why it works, aside from using the word feeling. It's not the content exactly. It's that those people are searching for something that's very similar to what George was searching for.
If I can add to that, the very explicit point in the film is the David Frost interview when John Lennon and George Harrison are on stage trying to share with the world and talk about something to help people with their lives. And that was an enormous sea change. People who in a previous generation would have been called entertainers and who've been blessed with this tremendous focus of youth interest felt the burden to try and figure it out and try and share it with the rest of us. That was an enormous change. And I think the film does show quite clearly the sense of purpose that George and all the Beatles had about telling us all something new and taking advantage of the position that we, the fans, have given them.
Also, this is a period that those who are around will remember, it was the major shift in our culture in a way. And, the Time magazine cover is God Dead, and I think we have a clip of it in the film. At the time of so many different things were happening. And this was the clear. Ultimately, you watch David Frost's interview, and it's quite interesting because he does eventually bring up the word God. You see, the great fear was that it would be a godless generation, and all of what that implies in the sense of the breakdown of the society. And here you are, I think, the group that represents the most to this young generation and gives the example, may be saying that. And this is where the conflict comes in, because in a sense we thought that it's making us think more about it, you see, and question more and find more. And that was the way of thinking about it. But that was a very extraordinary decade, and of course, at times very frightening for the status quo.
Here in front.
Yeah, I just would like to state before I ask the question that I am with Mr. Scorsese's generation, so I'm speaking from that perspective. I think that he's made an extraordinarily moving, remarkable film here, and that the film shows an extraordinary understanding of what George Harrison was going through in his life. I wonder whether during the film he came to identify specifically with some of the issues that George Harrison some of the questions that George Harrison was trying to answer, how that impacted him, and how that may change the focus of his work in reaching out to other people as well.
The questioner who states that she is of Mr. Scorsese's generation and congratulates him on making such a moving portrait of George Harrison, asks that if during the course of making the film you yourself came to identify with some of these deeper questions that George Harrison was asking of himself, and if that in turn affected the shape of the film, and if it would affect your work in the future beyond this film.
I don't know if I came to. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why, after again, you're reading the letter to his mother. One of the reasons why I did the film and why I was always interested in his work, because of those questions. But because that's how I started. It's what I started out in my life. That's really what it was in terms of having a Roman Catholic cultural background. New York, mid-century. That's 50, 60 years ago. Very, very different time for the Catholic Church in New York. And so I was very serious about it for many different reasons. And yes, there's always been something beyond that. Excuse me one sec. Yeah. Is that right? Sorry, there was a... for me, I don't know how to express it. The only way I can express it is by making pictures like this and hoping to make similar kinds of things in the future. But I also enjoy making movies, so I've tried many different kinds. But no, the questions have always been there, and I think the great risk here was to embrace that and go with it as much as possible. Particularly the guy who says he's 21 or 22 years old, he's gotten everything, but he realizes, wait a minute, what is it? So now a lot of people spend their lives to a certain extent in a kind of a richer society, trying to achieve things and acquire things. And then once you do, what then? What is it? Is that it? So that's always been in my head that way. And as you get older too, and so it's a different. It seems to be goes right back to themes and thoughts that I had about back in my film Mean Streets, really, which is about similar way how to lead one's life in a world like that.
We have time for a couple more in the center here.
Yes. If this film, and I think it will, has an impact or a change on the way the world remembers Harrison, what would you like that change to be?
The question is this film, and the questioner believes that it will have an impact on the way that people view and remember George Harrison. What would you? I assume is this a question
for everyone?
This is a question for everyone. What would you like that change to be in the way that people remember George Harrison?
Well, George himself wasn't that, to be honest, that concerned about creating something a specific way people remembered him. His work was his music, and he thought if his music could touch people, that's really all he ever hoped. Maybe a song would touch one person. So for me, I just know that that this film is honest. And, it's really not that easy a thing for me to watch. I would like, you look back on life, you don't want to see the struggles you went through. But but it's an honest film, and so there's the man. And, making beautiful music, trying to lead a beautiful life, the pitfalls, the temptations. It's really, about the human condition. And he used to always say that, it's about the human condition. And he explored, he pushed himself, but he always came back to this one desire, this one goal. That's how I remember him. That's what I know about him. So I think people should remember his music. And really, I think that's the most one can ask. But it is an honest film about a very curious man, bold and seductive and honest and beautiful.
Can I answer that?
By all means.
In the film, Tom Petty says George liked to surround himself with people who are really good at something. And then Terry Gilliam lists all the things that George did. And one of the things that struck me in working on this film is that if you take the other areas that George focused on, he was at the top level of achievement in all those other areas. He brought what we now call the world music movement to the West, or he was one of the people that was groundbreaking on that. Of course, his work in charitable concerts was groundbreaking, and so it goes on. But just take Handmade Films. George started and founded an English film company, Handmade Films, which is now part of the legacy of British cinema. And he did that, as we see from the film, to help his friend get his movie made. But if George had just started Handmade Films and not been in the Beatles and not done anything else, he would still be a very important character in the history of British cinema. And that's just one of the things he did. And I think on a practical level, that's something I take away from this film.
Yes, standing in the back.
This is for Marty. I know you had a lot of material to work with here, but as someone who's worked so hard in preservation, film was the material that you ran into that wasn't properly preserved?
It's a question about, for Marty, as someone who's been so passionately committed to film preservation, was there material that you would have liked to have included in this film that wasn't possible because the material was not properly preserved?
I think we were pretty lucky on all of that, David, weren't we?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think we were lucky. Obviously, a lot of all the television networks in the United States and all over, they destroyed a lot of their archives, on the one hand. On the other hand, our researchers, contacted a local television station in Scotland that had film from 1963, a tour of Scotland that the Beatles were doing, and no one had seen it in all these years. And the same went for Australia and different places. I also think the Mondo Cane film, for instance, which is the Hamburg footage, it's been restored beautifully. So we were lucky in that regard that there was this, document of what Hamburg was like in the 60s in color.
so we're pretty lucky on that.
We couldn't find, there was a moment when the Hare Krishna, the Radha Krishna singers were on Top of the Pops.
Oh.
And that was something that we couldn't find. We really were
right.
trying, and no one's really
Yeah.
seen that. But that would have been, I would have liked to have seen that.
That was tricky because new stuff would come in. And we're talking, as we said, talk about 5 years. And one of the reasons it takes 5 years is because this kind of thing that you grow with, there are no deadlines. It just happens to be finished now. All of this, for me, this whole year has been a series of films we've been working on for quite a while that all happen to be finished at the same time. Since November of last year to November of now, finishing up a new one right now. But so it's kind of enjoyable, but at the same time, what is really important about this kind of working on a film is living with the film, meeting, talking, screening it, thinking about it, working, talking. David working for a couple of weeks, bringing me back in the room, thinking I'm going to be in the room for 10 or 15 minutes instead of being there 3 hours talking, coming back, working on the other films. And all this goes on. There's no pressure I mean, there's pressure, but it's about distribution, about release. But there was a couple of other ones we did. We learned that, though. We had to release at a certain time, and then we missed the date, and everybody would be upset. Look, we can't. That's one of the things we started with this picture. I said, we can't. There's no way we can guarantee a date. And once I said, okay, we can aim for a certain date. We tried to that. We also slipped behind a year. But I think because of that process, everything was new, everything was fresh, and everything was anticipatory. We always knew we can get something would come in. Sometimes it was a little scary because in a good way, because if more good stuff came in, when are we going to finish this? So, go on and on. But and it was a real joy to work on and with, and very moving experience working on it. It was a real lifesaver.
The other interesting thing about the archival process is that this film, because we were spanning 58 years, there was really every format ever invented on video or film.
Yeah.
So, the process of transferring all the different material and making sure that we had everything looking as good as it could possibly look, particularly with some of the 70s video formats. I mean, it was really a challenge to try to... We actually tried to restore the 74 footage, and we realized, well, that just looks worse. You kind of almost have to live with some of that history.
And it's only going to get worse. Digital age. Yeah.
If there's a cautionary tale in terms of the archival footage, it would be that the David Frost stuff was thought to be lost. And it took, I think it's 3 different shows that we take it from. I'm not sure they were all lost, but it took the researchers over 2 years to get the footage. And most of the sources of the footage that had the footage in the past had destroyed it.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but David Tedeschi